Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brookbanks Podcast. My name's Sophie Watkins, part of the central team here at Brookbanks, and today I have with me Callum Parker, Associate Director as part of one of our teams, and Katherine Peers, Senior Hydrologist as well. So we're here to talk about SuDS and SABs today from both of you guys. So kick us off then, Callum. SuDS and SABs. What's the difference, and tell us a bit about them.
So SuDS are sustainable drainage systems. 20 years ago, when I think the term was first coined, they were sustainable urban drainage systems. But then, as sustainable drainage came to the forefront, the urban was dropped from the title, but it remained in the acronym. So they're sustainable drainage systems. And SABs, another acronym, are SuDS Approval Bodies. And they were formulated as part of Schedule 3 being enacted in Wales in 2019. And they take on the role of what the LLFA used to do, but they're tasked with looking at all SAB applications and making sure that they comply with the SuDS standards.
Fantastic. Over to you, Katherine. So tell us a bit about your role at Brookbanks and how you work as a senior hydrologist.
Yeah, so I've been at Brookbanks now for 8.5 years, working in the land development and community teams, and my primary focus is on flood risk and drainage applications. So looking at flood risk assessments, environmental statement chapters, and looking at the outline drainage design for primarily residential developments, but also commercial and expanding.
Fantastic. And Callum, you joined us about 6 months ago here at Brookbanks, and you're based over in Cardiff in one of our Wales offices. So tell us a bit about your past experience and how you're working with SuDS over in Wales.
So I've been here 6 months. It's flown by. In my previous life, I was working at a smaller engineering firm. I've been a civil engineer for almost 20 years now. I started out as an apprentice. I've always worked in Wales, and my focus has always been infrastructure, specifically surface water drainage and flood risk management.
So leaping back to you then, Callum. So obviously SuDS, we've had an initial sort of outline of what SuDS are and SABs as well. How would you actually develop a SuDS strategy? What are the key elements to that?
Well, the key elements would be starting with how we meet the 4 pillars of SuDS, and the main principle of any sustainable drainage system is to mimic greenfield regime as much as possible. So if we were looking at a site, or when we look at a site, we would start with, is the site brownfield? What is the existing use, or is the site greenfield? It gives us an indication of the existing drainage regime. Are we looking at a site that's positively drained, or are we looking at a site that doesn't have any drainage at all? You would want to look at the topography of the site. Where does gravity take the water? Where are those natural flow paths? And that really is the sort of key, or one of the keys to SuDS, is not changing the natural course of water. Where does the water flow? Where are those flow paths? And let's keep those flow paths where they are and develop around them, as opposed to putting the development in first and then diverting flow paths, which can cause flooding either on site or off site. The key really is to try and mitigate any new development to make sure that it's outside of flood zones. And then once you've established those principles, you can really then start to build on that with more detailed design, looking at things like flow rates, volumes, those sorts of things.
So over to you then, Katherine. So obviously that's a general outline of a strategy and the approach that we'd take. Things are different, obviously, in England to Wales. Obviously, we had the regulations come in, whereas in England it's currently guidance only. So what are the sort of lessons learned that we're seeing coming through?
So yeah, we've had the new guidance that came in 2025, which is important because it has created a more consistent multifunctional approach across all of the councils, which we didn't have before. We are still looking at councils interpreting them in different ways because it is guidance and not legislation, and they're still trying to fit into their own policies and their own agendas that they have for their local areas. But what it has focused on is how we then, as Callum, linking back to Callum, is how we review that site, how we look at the constraints of that site to start with. So what we've started to look at now is different flow rates. So whereas before we were looking at reducing discharge rates to Q bar, we're now looking at Q1, which is the 1 in 1 year storm event, which has become more prevalent in the design process. We're restricting volumes back even more, and we're looking at incorporating more interception mechanisms at an earlier design stage. So the outline that we knew even 2-3 years ago is completely different to how you would have to look at an outline application process now.
That's the thing that we're particularly good at, because we do this in Wales on a day-to-day basis. We have that skills and that expertise to be able to adapt very quickly to the sort of changing scene in England. As Kat mentioned, the standards are non-statutory, it's still guidance, but councils are taking that as a sort of best practice and are asking for different things which you wouldn't normally do. Like Katherine said, 3 or 4 years ago, your outline planning was looking really, really different to now. But I think the strength that Brookbanks have, which is really good, is that we know what the best practice is in Wales. We know what we need to do in order to gain SAB approval. So using that knowledge and that experience, it transfers across to England quite well.
So what are those key differences that you've seen then, Callum? Obviously, we're talking about with doing SAB applications in Wales in terms of we're applying some of the best practice. What are those bits that we're actually seeing the lessons learned from? What are the key takeaways?
The key takeaways are definitely tougher regulations on restriction of flow. As Kat mentioned, generally we're not restricting flows to Q bar now, we're restricting flows to Q1, and that seems to be a universal thing across, I think it's 92 LLFAs in England, where everyone is asking that flows are restricted to Q1. And it's not just flow, volume restriction as well. We're looking at protecting ecological and morphological aspects of downstream receptors like watercourses and things like that. So there really is a focus on volume restriction, and where these things are regulatory in Wales, they're not quite regulatory in England, but authorities are taking this non-statutory guidance and applying what they want in terms of sustainable drainage.
So top tips and guidance then, Katherine, in terms of English applications for developments and things. What would be your top 3?
I think the top 3 would be you have to start accepting and start looking into that slightly more detailed drainage process at an earlier stage. Some councils still are accepting just your basin at the lower end of your site, but a lot more councils now are expecting you to see where you're incorporating your interception features, such as rain gardens, tree pits, your roadside swales, even if you haven't got a detailed layout. So it's that understanding of that needs to be done at this stage. It doesn't need to be a full detailed. You don't need to give exact volumes or rates for each of those on plot and at source interception features, but you just need to acknowledge it at this early stage. So it's that acceptance that change is happening and it is going to become more important.
I think Katherine hit the nail on the head there with the sort of early engagement. That's one of my top priorities with any SAB scheme, is get into the SAB early or get into the LLFA early, schedule a meeting and talk about those principles. I'd like to talk about the first 3 or 4 SuDS standards, depending on whether the job is in Wales or England. We need to set out principles for surface water destination. That's just it, and it's much the same as the building regs hierarchy, but we need to set that out from the start. Hydraulic control, that is another huge one. We need to agree that principle. We think it's going to be Q1. In fact, we know it's going to be Q1, but we need that agreement with the local authority. And the third one is interception. We really need to make sure that we are hitting that interception criteria. And that really does impact your NDA. It will impact the master plan. So getting those 3 or 4 first principles in at a super early stage with the LLFA or the SAB is really going to de-risk the project as it carries on into detailed design, and really puts us in good shape to deliver a scheme that is not only cost efficient but also will pass in terms of planning and LLFA scrutiny.
Yeah, I think those conversations are even more important early on, especially if you have a constrained site as well. If you've got utilities running through your site, if you have restrictive access locations that interrupt or determine where your SuDS features can't go, so your lowest point of your site where you may require to put your basin in, or a similar SuDS feature, you may have to put your access in that location, and then it's just agreeing with the council at that early stage. We've acknowledged that that is there, however, this is a bigger constraint. Or you may have a badger set or an area of TPOs that you have to avoid, and it's just that how can we work with the council at the early stage to keep with their guidance and their requirements and their policies, while also adhering to the standards at the same time, without any further constraints or loss of NDA to the clients.
And that happens more than you think, doesn't it, Kat? I know we were working on a site a few weeks ago, and we did all of this. We looked at the topography, we looked at natural flow paths, we put in our features, and then we had asset results back, and we could see that there was a large diameter water main running through the site, and we put our SuDS features right on top of that. Again, and then it was, well, that can't happen, back to the drawing board. It worked out, which was great, but it's having that early engagement with the LLFAs, with the client, and with any other interested interested stakeholders who may have other interests in the site as well.
We like to think, don't we, that every site's the same. We can use it as a cookie cutter method and sort of copy paste, but every site is so different, isn't it, in terms of its geography and its layout and what infrastructure is already in the ground.
Oh, definitely. And it would be so much easier if you could just, like you say, just take that cookie cutter approach and just throw it around. And I mean, there is merit in that. I mean, we all have a sort of arsenal of sort of like ready-made measures, but and they can be useful. They can be very useful at early stages. For example, while we're trying to figure out what the SuDS design may look like. Maybe we have a site that has really, really good infiltration potential. Well, then we can start saying, well, actually, we can use these areas here for soakaways, and you can apply that sort of method. But you also have to have in the back of your mind that every site is bespoke. And I think this is the strength of SuDS. Every SuDS scheme is bespoke, and SuDS are bespoke as well. So whereas using traditional methods of drainage, you're sort of stuck in this robust framework of what you can provide, with SuDS, they are a little bit flexible. So you can come up with schemes or navigate problems in a different way that you perhaps wouldn't be able to do with traditional drainage. And I think we need to start looking at SuDS like that. They're not a problem. They're not a constraint. What they actually help do is solve traditional constraints that we may see with traditional drainage methods.
The only way they become a constraint is if it's not taken into consideration at the earliest stage. If you left the drainage right to the last minute and you've already got your fixed transport, you've already got your fixed master plan, you've got your fixed ecology constraints, and then you try and fit drainage in, that's when you start having the issues. That's when you start having those cost implications and loss of NDA.
And I suppose it keeps it interesting for the designers and the hydrologist, doesn't it, if you can mix things up a bit rather than those traditional plans. Is there anything particular different, Callum, that you like to throw in there now that you have more freedom with?
I mean, I'm quite partial to drainage above ground storage, above ground conveyance. It's cheaper, it's simpler, it's easier to maintain. More importantly, you can see if it goes wrong because it's on the surface. And yeah, it's nice to have water flowing through a development. And using sustainable drainage techniques really allows you to, to play around with those things. Your shallow swales or your dry swales, things like that. And they're also really, really good for biodiversity. They're really good for amenity. They're really good for water quality and pollution mitigation, and they're very good for conveyance and storage. So as a single tool to hit those four SuDS pillars, swales really, yeah, they're great. They're my go-to, and they just look nice as well. They look nice. I'm a keen cyclist, and cycling along a nice cycle path, and you've got a lovely swale, next to you. It's really nice, I think that's those sort of benefits, those amenity benefits, and perhaps those biodiversity benefits, they may get lost early on in the design, and it's good to try and keep them at the forefront as well, because we're all trying to achieve the same thing: a really high quality development for the end user.
And I suppose that feeds into all phases, doesn't it, of a development? You need to think about the end user and the actual residents of whatever property, whether it's development for commercial use or residential or any other means, whether it's the education sector, healthcare sector. There's the end people at the end of the scheme. So making sure that we do the phasing in the correct way is really important, isn't it? So you're not, trying to have water flowing through a site during build, but equally you've got it there at the end so that it looks great and it functions well. So in terms of the challenges, then obviously we've talked about the nice things and the freedom of the design and the biodiversity benefits, but in terms of the challenges that we're facing, Callum, how's the experience in Wales going to actually transpire across through to England?
Yeah, it's not been a smooth ride, and I think with anything like this, I think, well, we've had SABs in Wales now for 7 years, and there are challenges. There's challenges around the legislation. We look at it in terms of what do we need to do to make our SuDS design hit the criteria, and it's about that regulatory compliance. But I think sometimes we look at that so hard that we sort of like fall away from what's actually practical, what is easy to live with, what is practical and easy to construct, what is practical to maintain. And I think sometimes those elements can get lost. You could come up with something that's quite a simple design, works really well, and is practical and easy to maintain, but it may not hit all of the regulatory standards. And where do you go from there? Do you come up with something that's harder to maintain and less practical, and could be less efficient, could cause more risk of flooding, but it's okay because it hits the regulatory compliance? I think there's a lot of talking still to be done in Wales around that point, and it is happening. We've got the SAB Society. That is such a welcome group that has been formed with buy-in from different LLFAs, and that's really encouraging to see that. And they're currently looking at the SAB process, engaging with different authorities, engaging with designers, developers, and different stakeholders to try and sort of fix those challenges that people are facing. Because I think there's broad agreement across the sector that this is a good thing. SuDS are a good thing. It's just sometimes there's a trade-off between practicality, buildability, maintenance liability, and meeting those regulatory compliances.
And then I think the issue that we're then going to have when and if Schedule 3 gets implemented in England is where the guidance is currently just guidance, and all the councils and LLFAs are interpreting it into their own way. When it does become mandatory and you do get that a sub approval that's required, it's going to be a lot more restrictive of how they're reviewing it, how they're how they're going to approve the design, what they're going to accept. So you might find that shift in current council's guidance into that acceptance if it does come forward.
And are we seeing a lot of chatter about that already? Are we seeing shifts already happening across England?
I think it's just the shift in the interpretation of the guidance that we have at the moment. And that's where it could unravel if a Schedule 3 or a sub process comes in play.
But I think, I mean, obviously, and again, Brookbanks having that presence in Wales, we've been through that. And old LLFAs had their own interpretations. I used to work for an LLFA 3 or 4 years before SAB came in, and we had our own interpretation. And the LLFA across the border, they had their interpretation, and it's something that we've dealt with before. It's a problem that we've had before, a challenge that we've had before, and we found a solution. So again, I think it just highlights when I say our Brookbanks' unique ability to be able to meet that challenge with prior experience and be able to come up with a solution that again is going to help the client, help the end user, de-risk the project, and benefit the scheme overall.
Fab. So we're coming towards the end of our podcast. So if anyone does want to get in touch with you, Callum, or Katherine, how can they get in touch and ask you about your favourite drainage strategies?
So my email address is callum.parker@brookbanks.com. So drop me a line and we'll go for coffee or have a chat or do something. I would love to talk about SuDS. I could talk about SuDS all day.
Yeah, and my email address is katherine.peers@brookbanks.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on this episode of the Brookbanks Podcast, and we'll see everyone again shortly. Thank you.